Good morning and welcome to the Monday morning class. My name is Julian. I'm going to be hosting this 60-minute introduction to Kantian, transcendentalism, Hegelian, speculative idealism, and a lot of other ideas along the way. This class is designed for beginners, so if you're joining us for the first time, welcome. Fret not, you don't need to have any previous knowledge of philosophy or theory. Anybody can join us. If you're wondering why I'm by myself this morning and not joined by Jenny, she's currently getting us a cup of coffee. She's going to be back any moment. So I'm going to entertain myself with a brand of crackers that will not be named because I'm not sponsored, but this is my breakfast this morning. So hello everybody. Hope you are doing well. This class, This class is going to be 60 minutes. It's going to be totally open access. Totally free for anybody who wants to join. Now, hello from Germany. Hello to people in Germany. Hello to people in Israel. It was a huge mistake to start eating. Now I have to chew. Okay, so we've just wrapped up our road trip, our tour of the West Coast. We went to Berkeley, California. We went to Oakland, California. We went to San Francisco, California. We went to Eugene and Portland, Oregon. We went to the symphony. We went to the opera. We went to 2 basketball games. We did everything. And now we are back in Washington and we're taking a break from touring and we're going to go back on the road in March. We're going to go back on the road in March to the East Coast this time. We're going to do a tour of New England, Boston, New York City. And then in the summer, we're probably going to be in Europe, in case you guys are in Europe. Here is Jeneline. Good morning.
Woohoo!
Thank you so much for getting us a hot cup of coffee.
Yes, if you hold
That's
that
wonderful.
I'm going to...
Thank you.
You're very, very welcome. It is very chilly this morning.
It is a cold morning, and we are joined by people from Kosovo, Germany, Israel, around the world. Please do let us know where you're joining us from. It makes us very happy to know that we are sort of like in a magic school bus of
Yes,
international
I
students.
Like I'm going to, this is you.
Okay, excellent.
I'm going to do a little copy
Moscow.
Drew.
Now, if you're joining us for the very first time, these classes are totally free. They're totally open access. I've been teaching them for the past year and a half, every week on Instagram. Basically since the pandemic started, since our university shut down, I decided to take the classes to the internet, on the road. And if you'd like to support these classes and also download bonus content for every class, like summaries and, bonus podcasts, etc., please consider becoming a patron. It's our Patreon and our patrons that keep these classes free for everybody else. So on behalf of our global learning community, a very big thank you to our patrons who are currently funding this project and keeping the classes free for everybody, which is beautiful because I love the fact that we can do open access education. That is just the coolest thing.
I have to say we like doing open access education in our very high-tech recording studio because we don't have microphones or cameras or lighting. As you can see, we've sought out the best sunlight we can, and it's a little gray today.
Everything we've ever done for this project has been done on our phones. This is a 100% iPhone generated project.
Yes.
I feel like Apple should sponsor us. They'd be like, bringing knowledge to the world through an iPhone. Okay, anyway, knowledge is a big word. First of all, I'm going to offer you a biscuit brand that shall not be named because we're not branded. Also, don't underestimate the amount of chewing you have to do to get through one of these. I put one of these in my mouth, and I was chewing for several seconds.
It helps with coffee.
I know. Okay, so I think we should just begin. You don't need any previous knowledge to join this class. It's going to be an introduction to Hegelian speculative idealism, but fret not. It's going to be hopefully intuitive and fun and accessible. Our one and only goal is to bring you, quote-unquote, high theory in a supposedly low manner. And Jeneline is joining us to just sort of keep the vibe nice and hang out and make contributions and just be a cool person. So, all right. So I want to start with Kant for a moment, and just bear with me. You don't need to know anything about Kant. So Kant has this idea about money. where he talks about, and everybody will understand this. Immanuel Kant, the transcendentalist philosopher, Immanuel Kant says, just because you have a concept of money doesn't mean that you can spend it. In other words, just because you have an idea of $100 in your pocket doesn't mean that you can actually spend $100 in your pocket. Just because you can imagine the most beautiful woman doesn't mean that you can actually marry that person. Just because you can have a concept of God, for example, doesn't mean that God exists. Except for Kant, because Kant will always make an exception when it comes to God.
Kant is the wishy-washy philosopher. Yes.
Well, except for God. Except for God, God is precisely the concept that you can have in your pocket, even if you know he doesn't exist. Anyway, so Kant has this idea about money, which he says that just because you can think $100 doesn't mean that you can spend $100. You can't actually put it in your pocket, as it were. And this is, in a weird way, Kant's idea of saying something that would essentially go against everything that Hegel would later do. Because Hegel, and this is why Hegel is the poor man's philosopher, Hegel would say that the only money you can spend is conceptual money. That real money can't be spent, and only conceptual money can be spent. In other words, that the abstraction is more real than the concrete money. And I was sort of hoping to have your input on this as a political economist.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting discussion because there's so many tensions and contradictions in money as a social construct, but also we've talked before about the tension between use value and exchange value. But there's also this paradox of, like, if someone's really rich and they buy a really expensive house, they no longer, in a sense, they're no longer rich because they don't have, I mean, they've spent all their money on their house, so they don't necessarily have the resources that they once had. But finance is all about circumventing and short-circuiting that paradox through credit and debt financial instruments, which is why it's much easier to run up huge amounts of debts on a credit card than it is on a debit card, because a debit card is just drawing money directly from your account. You can't overdraw that, whereas a credit card is creating the kind of fictional money exactly that you're talking about.
Yeah, that's really well put. In a sense, you could say that money is the material marker for what is an otherwise speculative substance, which is value. And money is an indicator of value, which can not be just value generated, but also value owed. And this is something I think you've talked about a lot, is that money can also be a way in which we conceptualize money that you are, not just money you have, but money you are good for. Right?
Yeah, this joke about like the only person that a bank will loan money to is the man who already has money. This idea that it's all about credibility. I mean, even to talk about creditworthiness and credibility is to talk about social standing and all of these other things. Like, if everything's about money except money, which is about power.
Exactly.
Okay.
And it's this idea of, like, money also brings a certain amount of trustworthiness. And it's funny because it used to be that you would think about the fact that poor people were actually more trustworthy because they had nothing to lose. And today it's the other way around. Today we think of rich people as being more trustworthy because they have nothing to gain. Of course, anybody who knows a rich person knows that that's exactly not the point. They have everything to gain constantly. Okay, so what I'm talking about here is basically about the relationship between what in philosophical terms is called in itself and for itself. And it's important to note that depending on which philosopher you go with, there's a very different idea of what in itself and for itself means, whether you're going with Heidegger or Sartre or Kant or Hegel, or even in a sense you could go all the way back to Plato. So one of the things that I'm going to do in this class is I'm going to try to point out how the concept of in itself and for itself develops between traditional metaphysics, Kantian transcendentalism, and Hegelian speculative idealism. That's going to be our agenda today, but it's like we're gonna slip it in. We're gonna put the poison, like, what is it? The poison comes with the sugar, or was it the pill? The pill comes with the sugar pill? I don't know what it is. We're basically gonna slip in some of the idealist poison with all the other things we're talking about. Okay, so I want to start with something that, like, everybody can understand on an intuitive level, which is that every tragedy contains its own comedy. Now, the most literal version of that is, of course, Schadenfreude, the German word for experiencing pleasure at somebody else's pain. And think about it, most comedy works like this. Either we enjoy watching a cringeworthy situation, something that makes us go, eh, or we enjoy watching an actual physical calamity, like fail compilation videos on the internet. And it's not just that we sort of chuckle. It's like these are actually like uproariously funny to us. At least maybe I'm speaking for myself here. So in a weird way, everybody's tragedy is somebody else's comedy. And it has everything to do with your subjective stance on what is happening. But the most pure form of comedy, I would argue, the purest form of the comedic element, is when something that you think is happening to somebody else suddenly becomes experienced as happening to you. In other words, the comedy is that you look at something and you think you're experiencing Schadenfreude, and then suddenly it inverts and you realize it's happening to you. For example, a car being towed. You look at a car being towed and you think to yourself, oh man, that sucks for that guy, but it's also kind of funny. And then you suddenly realize that the license plate is your own car. And you go from haha to aha, basically. And that's, you know what I mean.
Yeah, exactly.
And this is like a classic trope within traditional comedies. It's the idea that you're watching something that seems to be funny and suddenly it becomes tragic. And so we've actually gone, in a very crude and crass sense, we've gone from an in itself to for itself. In itself, you're enjoying the situation because you think that you are apart from it. It is outside your reach. And then suddenly when it becomes subjectivized, it becomes for itself. It becomes something distinctly about your own subjective experience of your own reality. And that's where it becomes comedy and it becomes tragedy. Of course, as the mechanism continues, the reason that's funny is because somebody else is secretly watching you undergoing that process, in a sense. Does that make sense? So,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, I'm with you.
And so what we're going to talk about is the way in which, for different strains of philosophy, we conceptualize this in itself. And in itself, which finally for Lacan almost becomes the idea of the Lacanian real. But again, if you're joining us for the first time, you don't need to know any of this conceptual jargon, any of this blah, blah. I want to talk a little bit more about value and relate that to in itself and for itself. Now, the traditional conception, the classic metaphysical idea of in itself, is that in itself is out of our reach. That the pure form, the ideal substance, what Plato called the idea, which is also where idealism comes from, if you hadn't put that together yet, is something that is outside the reach of human consciousness. In other words, that life on Earth is a copy of this ideal form. And there's a story that I was reading about in the New Yorker that is like the perfect example of how this works. Again, this is illustrative. And it's about a man who we could call the man who lost $500 million in Bitcoin. And I was hoping that Jenlene might be our exposition queen on this very quickly. Is that okay?
A man? Well, Julian pointed out something which I hadn't realized, which was part of the appeal of manufacturing Bitcoin was that...
There's a hair in my coffee.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay. Sorry, yeah, back to you. Back to you.
In the early days of manufacturing Bitcoin, or producing it, or whatever the verb is. Mining, thank you. It was very, very easy to produce the earliest Bitcoin, and it got progressively more difficult. And this man was responsible for mining some of the earliest Bitcoin, which he stored on like a external hard drive or a USB device, which his wife naturally threw away.
Why naturally?
Because wives are always trying to, clean up after their husbands. Well, I feel like it's sort of like the Schadenfreude. The story isn't quite as good if he threw it away, but he has been petitioning the town dump to let him comb through the trash and try to recover this long-lost drive that contains what is now several $1 million worth of Bitcoin.
Hundreds of millions.
Hundreds of millions.
Yes, exactly.
And so making him simultaneously incredibly wealthy, potentially, but also completely impoverished.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a like, you could write a Greek tragedy about this story. Like, it has all the elements of hubris and sort of like self-destructiveness, etc. So you're exactly right. We have a man who's mining Bitcoin, and he's one of the early adopters. Now, part of the process of Bitcoin is that there's a finite amount of Bitcoin. I think it's like 21 million or something. And the more Bitcoin that are mined, the harder and more resource intensive it gets to mine the next Bitcoin. Which means that if you were an early adopter, you could actually mine a certain amount of Bitcoin, like thousands, that would be impossible today. Like, you would need to run an entire household on max electricity the whole year just to get a fraction of that. And so this man was in the unique situation of having a lot of Bitcoin on a hard drive which he'd put away, and his wife had taken out the trash and had thrown away the Bitcoin. And so, I mean, as you already said, sorry, I realize I'm just repeating this, but it's like, whatever. Exposition's like the Achilles heel of these classes, I realize. People are like, just get on with it. And so what happens is that he realized that the hard drive is probably not destroyed. In fact, you can actually salvage most hard drives. Like, there was a hard drive that was salvaged from like a rocket that crashed from outer space, for example. Like, as long as fragments of the glass disk are intact, you can reconstruct most of the information. And so he wanted to access the 64-digit code, the key code that would give him access to his Bitcoins. And what's so frustrating about this is that it would have been merciful if the disk had been destroyed. If his hard drive had actually physically been destroyed and there was evidence of the destruction, he could let it go. Except he knows that the hard drive probably exists, and that if only he could reach it, he would find salvation. Now, if that isn't an example of classic metaphysical idealism, then I don't know what is. We have here basically the Bitcoin equivalent of Plato going, the pure form, an idea, the essence that provides the key to all truth, lies behind an inaccessible barrier. Except for Plato, the inaccessible barrier was the realm of the gods. For Bitcoin Man, the inaccessible barrier is the municipal waste facility, the dump. So we have high and low already a little bit here. So that's the basic principle. Of course, as you pointed out, Jeneline, what's tragic about this is the fact that on paper or on the hard drive, this man is one of the wealthiest people in the United Kingdom. In reality, here's a man who's spent most of his waking life coming up with elaborate PowerPoint presentations on how to sort through an enormous pile of trash to find a hard drive. So there's a Quixotic element here, of course. Mm-hmm. And I mean, anyway, I don't want to go too deep into the story. You can read the New Yorker article. It's sad and interesting and hilarious all at the same time. And very human. The sense that there's an unreachable something, and if only we could reach that one thing, our life would be perfect. And we orient and structure our entire life around wanting to retrieve that. Of course, this is also what loss is about, essentially, right? Loss isn't lost because it's gone for good. Loss is the sense that even though it's gone, it feels painfully still present in your life. If anything, loss would be merciful if it were actually gone. From a Lacanian perspective, this is also why Lacan always says that anxiety isn't about loss, which is the Freudian concept of anxiety. Anxiety for Lacan is about over-proximity to the object. And here we have exactly the same principle with Bitcoin Man. If he'd actually lost the hard drive, it would be a relief. He could say, well, it didn't happen. It sucks, but it didn't happen. What makes him anxious, what prevents him from living his life, is that he is painfully close to the hard drive. He can literally drive by the dump where he knows $500 million worth of money is on the other side of the fence. And so over proximity to the object of desire is what creates anxiety in this case. There's a lot of examples that you could draw from this particular instance.
Well, every time the price of Bitcoin surges, the news is full of stories of people who almost had, there's the guy who can't remember his login. Yeah. There's, someone who used it to buy pizza. There's all of these. The
pizza guy's pretty famous too. Yeah. He traded in like a fortune for two. Yeah. This is also why it's a speculative currency in that sense. Like, it exists purely in that kind of abstract realm, even though it can be spent. We'll get there eventually. Yeah. And what you mentioned, of course, is true for this man. So even though this man doesn't have access to his own money, his Bitcoin, he does have access to the relative value of the Bitcoin, which means that he's constantly calculating whether he gained 20 million or lost 20 million on any given day, even though it's entirely abstract. It's like he's never going to actually be able to spend that money. And so there's something like, there's a very Brechtian element here. And what I mean by that is like, there's sort of a tragicomic element where we have a miser who believes himself to be the richest man in the world, which again, could remind you of the Lacanian quip that the king, that a fool is a fool who believes he is, sorry, wow, I totally flubbed that. Lacan says that a king who believes he is king is the ultimate fool. Now, this is essentially the reversal of that. We have here a poor man who believes he is king. And that's a tragic figure to be in. In a sense, of course, this is how all value works, right? Value is something that can appear very immaterial. I feel like I had like a really good point, and it's just kind of like, it's like, what's his name in The Wolf of Wall Street, Matthew McConaughey, and he goes like, like that's what happened. Anyway, I thought you were going to talk about South Park and like the value where they like sacrifice the chicken and then it like goes, but that's for another time.
Yes.
Okay, so what I want to do here is I want to talk a little bit more about how we go from this classical idea of metaphysics, this idea of the in itself existing behind this barrier, to the idea of Kantian transcendentalism, and then from Kantian transcendentalism towards Hegelian speculative idealism. Because it's like a 1-2-3 movement. So Kantian transcendentalism still exists within the realm of what you could call Bitcoin man. Kant still believes that there is such a thing as an in itself that is inaccessible to us humans. And what's beautiful about Kant is that Kant says that the problem is distinctly paradoxical, which is that the only way that we can even think about the in itself is through human reason. And human reason is the barrier. In other words, what Kant basically does is that he transposes the barrier, the gap between the in itself and the for itself, he transposes it back into the subject itself. So imagine for a moment Bitcoin man. Instead of saying Bitcoin man is here, his wealth is in the dump, and there's a fence between him and his wealth. That is classic metaphysics. Instead, Kant says that the barrier for Bitcoin man exists in Bitcoin man himself, which is already a much more like poetic way of looking at it, because now you would realize that exactly, it doesn't really matter what is behind the fence.
Right.
The barrier to this man's life exists in his own mind.
Well, and it's tough because you do get the sense that that's what's going on, is he has this sense of like, if only I could convince the right people, if only I could talk to the right person, if only someone would see how right I am, then I would be able to do this thing.
He has hired an entire team of people to come up with like next level excavation projects, and he's petitioning the city, and the city has absolutely no interest in helping him in this. And of course, he's become convinced that the city maliciously doesn't want it because they're hiding something in the dump.
They've already found it.
Or something like this. I mean, yeah, of course. And so the Kantian transcendental element is to simply say that rather than the in itself over here and the for itself over here with a gap, that the gap is transposed into the subject. In other words, that the gap between the for itself and the in itself lies within human subjectivity itself, within human reason. Now, this is known as the so-called transcendental turn. The transcendental turn basically puts priority on the subject rather than on the object of desire for the subject. We've talked about that before in class, so I think that's like relatively intuitive. Now, this is where Hegel comes in. And as per usual, what Hegel does, this is like the basic Hegelian operation, is that he radicalizes Kant. He says that Kant was right, but not right enough, not radical enough. It's a little bit like what Lacan does to Freud. Lacan looks at Freud and takes the basic principles and radicalizes them, takes them even further. Because here's the 1-2-3 movement. Within classic, traditional antiquity, metaphysics, there's the idea, as I said already, that you have the subject, the person, the individual, and you have the in itself, the pure form, in the godly realm. And that there is a gap that separates the individual from the higher substance. Kant starts unwinding that mechanism by suggesting that the gap isn't actually formal, the gap exists within human reason itself. In other words, as soon as you try to conceptualize the higher realm of the gods, you run into a barrier, the famous antinomies. Where Kant has a famous cop-out is that Kant says that, we're thinking the pure substance, but we're just too limited. Our brains can't encompass the ideal. And so Kant says it still exists. In other words, Kant has transposed the barrier into the human subject, but he hasn't done the more radical thing, which is to say that the higher godly realm doesn't exist. Now, before you think that Hegel is an atheist, Hegel isn't making an argument against the gods or against God as such. Hegel's a deeply Christian thinker. But what Hegel does then is to simply formalize the logical conclusion of what Kant was already thinking. And here's how it works. If you have the ideal form and the subject down here, who is trying to reach the ideal form through human cognition, Kant says, well, the barrier is in the human mind, down here. There's no gate, no pearly gates. Hegel says, what if the ideal isn't up there? That's an illusion. What if the ideal pure form only emerges within human subjectivity as an awareness of the failure to reach the ideal? And this is like the classic Hegelian teleological move, which is also what Zizek then later adopts through Lacan, which is that you don't have the ideal from which something falls, and the fall is called man. Instead, you have the fall, which retroactively generates the ideal. And so Hegel has this super radical thing that he says. Hegel basically says that the ideal, so in itself, emerges only as appearance. In other words, in itself only emerges as for itself, which means that we no longer have in itself versus for itself. We now have in itself as the double of for itself. And this means that he's basically radicalized what Kant was trying to do, which is Kant was trying to pull away the in itself from the ideal realm and say, this is the barrier. And Hegel simply shows up and says, what if the thing that you thought was the barrier is in fact the door? What if that's where it lies? Okay, this is very abstract, so I'm going to give you a couple of examples so that we can unpack this. Because can I just say, as for you, someone who isn't a philosophy student, this is abstract, right?
Yes.
Is it sort of?
It makes sense.
It sort of makes sense. Okay, but let's fill it in. This is an example that I think is one of the best examples of speculative idealism I've ever seen. And it's a play. It's a play that you and I have both seen. Mm-hmm. And it's called The Visit. And it's a Dürrenmatt play. It's a German play, but it was adapted recently by Tony Kushner for, I guess, the National Theatre in London. Mm-hmm. And I'm not going to make you do exposition.
I was going to say, it's already quite a long play, and it's an outstanding play and adaptation. Yes.
It's okay, so here's a very quick summary of what the play is. Spoilers for The Visit. Yeah. Okay, so we have a town. We have a town of people, a relatively poor town, Midwest or something. Mm-hmm. And a woman who grew up in that town has left the town and become fabulously wealthy. She's essentially like a billionaire or something. The woman returns to the town, and she is supposed to be in town to meet up with her childhood lover, with her former boyfriend, who still lives in the town. And she makes a proposal to the mayor. She says, when I was a child, my boyfriend broke my heart. I will give you, and I will give the town, all the money in the world if you kill my former boyfriend. It's a basic offer. Here's an offer you can't refuse. If you do a hit on my former boyfriend, who's now an adult man, then I will make your town one of the wealthiest towns in America. You can probably guess what the mayor says. The mayor says, who do you think you are, you crazy woman? I've never seen somebody disrespect the values of this town as badly as you have. Do you think that we're some uncivilized crooks here? Do you think that your money can just stroll into this town and demand that we give you one of our own? One of our most treasured citizens? That's my dramatic reenactment.
This is surpassed exposition, by the way.
Thank you.
Reinterpretation.
And the woman says, okay, let's wait and see. and she stays in the town. Of course, this is a small town.
The man, I think it's worth pointing out that the man who she once killed is the town shopkeeper.
Yeah.
And he knows that everyone in the town is broke. But people,
No,
people start spending money as if they already have the money from this woman.
Yeah, so it's a small town.
Yes.
And word gets around quick. And they say, "Did you hear? There's a woman who said we could be fabulously wealthy." Of course, they leave out the bit where they have to kill the shopkeeper, who's like, he's like Mr. Rogers, right? Like, this is like the nicest guy in the town. Like, the backbone of the entire community is this guy. And so they all start speculating. In their mind, they start thinking about, well, maybe I'll renovate my front deck. Maybe I'll buy better clothes. Maybe I'll invest in Bitcoin. And so they all start taking out things on credit. And when the shopkeeper says, "How are you going to pay for it?" they say something like, "Well, I've heard that we're coming into great riches," etc. Now, none of them intend to kill the shopkeeper. They're purely acting speculatively. They've heard that there's going to be great wealth in the town. And so everybody starts acting as if they were already rich. What happens next? Should I text?
Go for it.
Yeah? Okay. What happens next? Spoilers for the visit. Eventually, the town starts to realize that the only thing keeping them from great wealth is the fact that they don't want to murder this guy. And so what slowly happens is that they start finding reasons, not even on purpose, to hate the shopkeeper. And eventually, they form a citizens' jury, a trial.
Because they need to have a democratic process.
A court.
Because they are enlightened, liberal, reasonable people. And they need to have a public debate about it. And if they go through a democratic election where everyone is represented, then they can make the right choice.
Exactly. And so, in a sense, they've already committed to killing the man. In other words, they've already spent the money as if they had it. Now they have to formalize why they're killing the man. And so what happens is that they put on a big show, and it's like the trial of the people, and they condemn the man for being the opposite of civic virtue and the person who secretly undermines the community, and they could all have done X if it weren't for him.
Because he doesn't want them to be rich. He doesn't want them to succeed.
And at the end of it, the townspeople all come together in a democratic vote to uphold democracy and to uphold the spirit of the town and execute the man. At which point, the whole mechanism clicks. Everything has come to pass exactly as the woman intended it. What's so important here, and why it's the perfect example of speculative idealism, is that for Hegel, this process is how everything works, how all history unfolds. It's not that you have principles that you are following. It's that you are retroactively putting in place the principles that justify the way in which you were already living. This is also why, for contemporary leftists, the idea of human rights is often criticized. The idea of democracy is criticized as being this kind of master signifier that doesn't come first but comes afterwards. We can talk more about that in another class. And so in a technical sense, if you have the difference between a form and a content, in traditional metaphysics, the content is seen as primary. Something is something, the in itself, and the form is a deviation from the content, the for itself. It's only within Hegelian speculative idealism that the content only appears retroactively through the form itself. In fact, through the form of its own disavowal. And so what happens in the visit, and why it's the perfect example of speculative idealism, is that what happens is that the town's very unwillingness to kill the man creates the conditions by which they create a narrative in which they have to kill the man. And so something that appears to be its very opposite comes into being precisely through the resistance that is posed to them. And there's something very tragic, but also very funny about this story. Again, to go back to the tragic comic element, where it's the very fact that the town upholds its principles that leads to the fact that they do the very thing that you would think is the opposite of its principle. Of course, there's also a paranoid element here. This is also true for totalitarian societies. A totalitarian society doesn't have a reactionary enemy. It doesn't have an enemy that exists on the other side of the wall. A totalitarian society finds the enemy within. This is one of the key differences between authoritarianism and totalitarianism. When you talk about the enemy of the people, that's a totalitarian instinct. Because, first of all, what is the people? At that point, you've decided that the one person who criticizes the all of society is, by virtue of that criticism, no longer the people. Similar, of course, to how Donald Trump accused journalists of being the enemy of the people. Of course, journalists are precisely the people who, from within the system, are criticizing the system. And so they're deemed part of the non-all in that sense. In a reactionary society, of course, there are reactionary overtones within Trumpism as well, the blame is put on the foreign component, on the foreign part, external rather than internal. This is also like one of the classic differences between the Soviet Union and the Third Reich. For Nazis, it was always about the external enemy. For Stalin, it was always about the internal enemy. And so you go through several phases of that, essentially. Okay, so we've actually done something fairly complicated here, which is we've gone from the idea of traditional metaphysics that posits the in itself as being behind a barrier, and the subject being, in a sense, like an inferior being trying to reach that essence, towards the idea within Kant that the barrier exists within the subject itself. In other words, that human reason, the human desire and capacity to think the in itself, to conceptualize it, is itself the barrier, which already has a very Kafkaesque element to it. Like, think back to the famous story in The Trial, where a man is in front of a gate for his entire life. He wants to speak to the person behind the gate. And then eventually, as he's about to die, having spent his entire life in front of the gate, the guardsman walks up to him and whispers into his ear, "The gate was only ever there for you." This is essentially Kantian transcendentalism. The barrier between the subject and the in itself is transposed into the subject. The in itself was only ever there for you as something that you couldn't access, which again is similar to the Bitcoin man.
I was going to say, this Bitcoin was only ever made just for you.
Exactly. We could well imagine that when Bitcoin man finally passes away, the guard walks up to him and whispers in his ear, and he says, "This hard drive was only ever meant for you." Maybe it was actually his wife. My secret, because he and his wife are no longer together, and my belief is that his wife, like, maybe secretly, I mean, I'm paranoid about this. It sounds sexist, but, like, it's great. Anyway, we can go into more detail about that in the Discord, because I actually know more facts about this story, but I don't want to,
I'm
like,
so intrigued.
I don't want to go down the deep end here.
I'm just here for the exposition.
Yeah, exposition lady. Okay, and so finally with Hegelian speculative idealism, we take that a step further, where now it's not that we have the in itself and the subject is a deviation of it. In other words, the form of life is not a deviation from the ideal content. Instead, the form is the only thing that posits the content retroactively, for which I tried to use the visit as an example. And we'll have more examples in the coming classes, because speculative idealism is like one of the main subjects of this series, Hegelian idealism. Now, what's important here is that if you want to understand the work of Slavoj Žižek, Žižek tries to highlight this passage by means of fusing something completely external to it. And the external thing that he's fusing into the sequence is Lacanian psychoanalysis. Lacanian psychoanalysis and the concepts of Lacanian psychoanalysis are used to illustrate this transition from classic metaphysics to Kantian transcendentalism, and finally to speculative idealism. Now, how and why does that work? Well, first of all, one of the things you have to understand about Lacan is that Lacan was an enfant terrible when it came to psychoanalysis. He broke all the rules. And he was always messing around with the internal mechanisms of psychoanalysis to almost make distinctly philosophical points. One of the things that Lacan believed was that psychoanalysts had made a mistake when they lost their connection to the philosophical tradition and their awareness of the philosophical tradition. So you can imagine how this would very quickly lead you into trouble. For example, one of the benchmarks of classic psychoanalysis, of the psychoanalytic session, was that it had a certain framework of time. That you would go into the session and you would speak, classic like Freudian like talking therapy. And I don't know what is it, 90 minutes or something? It must be shorter, 40 minutes. I don't know exactly what it is. And Lacan realized at a certain point that the breakthroughs always came in the last minutes. That a lot of it was just blah, 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 blah. And only at the point at which they were coming to the very end, and the patient knew that they were reaching the very end, would they suddenly say something that would be a breakthrough, which would also be nice because they'd leave feeling like they'd achieved something. And so one of the things that Lacan did very early on in his school of psychoanalysis, which started as the school, I need to get this right, but it started as the school, what is it, the cause, what we've done this before.
The school of Freud, the cause of Freud, the cause of the school.
Yeah, we lost the connection, unfortunately.
No!
I know. Let's see if we can get back. That really sucks. We're probably on like the wrong Wi-Fi here. This is such a bad moment to lose it.
Oh, that's frustrating.
I hope we don't lose the entire class. Hey, we're back.
Okay.
Okay, so we're talking about Lacanian psychoanalysis here. And so one of the first things that Lacan did in his school was that he said that we don't have a set time for the psychoanalytic sessions. Instead, we're going to have totally random and really short therapy sessions. Like literally you could walk in and 2 minutes later, he'd be like, okay, we're done. In other words, he was trying to short circuit the process by which people only have genuine insight in the final moments of the class. We've already lost. All right, we're back once again. Sorry, we keep losing this. I think that what's happening is that the School of Clinical Psychologists are like stepping on the Wi-Fi signal so that we can't talk about this. And so
someone say Freud?
One of the key Lacanian concepts is the concept of the real. And within the classic triad of the symbolic, the imaginary, and the real is, in a sense, the truth of the entire sequence. The real is the thing that can't be accessed. And if you think about it, one of the things that Lacan argued quite strongly was the idea that essence exists only in its own appearance. And it's a very small leap for Zizek to take that into Hegel. Lacan was not a Hegelian, by the way. This is Zizek's like, I don't know, doing something to Lacan that Lacan would have disapproved of. But the idea is that essence occurs only in appearance itself. Now, if you go back to the previous series we did, called The Hermeneutic Temptation, remember Lacan has a reading of the Parisian Veil. It's the myth of the Parisian Veil. And it's about a battle between two artists, between Parrhasius and Zeuxis. And they both commit to a challenge. The challenge is who can depict the most realistic bunch of grapes. And so what happens is that Zeuxis paints grapes, a still life of grapes, that is so convincing that the birds think it's real. They start pecking at the canvas. Now, when Zeuxis goes into the atelier, the studio, of Parrhasius, he sees that the painting is hidden behind a curtain. At which point he says, well, let's see the painting. And he realizes that the curtain was itself painted, that the curtain was an illusion, that Parrhasius didn't in fact paint the grapes. Parrhasius only painted the veil. In other words, Parrhasius painted the barrier. He didn't paint the thing behind the barrier. And so what happens, of course, is that Zeuxis succumbed to the hermeneutic temptation. Zeuxis succumbed to the desire to look behind the curtain, to posit an essence, the essence of grape, behind said curtain. Now, what is the lesson here? The lesson can be directly transposed to the triad between classic metaphysics, Kantian transcendentalism, and speculative idealism. In classic traditional metaphysics, we have something that exists behind the curtain, and you have to look behind the curtain. Of course, there's already an irony here, because within classic metaphysics, for example, for Plato, a painting would be already a copy of a copy. In other words, the grape itself wouldn't be the in itself. The grape would be a poor copy of the ideal form of the grape, and the painting that Zeuxis made of the grape, the still life, would be a copy of a copy, and therefore an abomination. Or in Freudian terms, distinctly uncanny. For Freud, what's uncanny is simply something inanimate which appears to us as animate. For example, dummies, or the double. We actually find, if you walked into your bedroom and you found an exact copy of you lying in bed, you would probably freak out. For Freud, two of the most uncanny things are things that move that shouldn't be moving, and double reflections of yourself. It's also like when we look into a mirror, one of the classic tropes within horror movies is that you walk away from the mirror and your reflection is still looking back at you. It's very scary, but not just scary, it's uncanny. And so Within classic metaphysics, this is the idea. It's the idea that the essence is behind the curtain. The essence is behind the barrier. Within Kantian transcendentalism, we, in a sense, have a more artistic idea of it, a subjective idea, the so-called transcendental turn, which is that there is still an in itself. There is still an essence, except the essence now lies within the failure to think the essence. Now, an analogy here is between Kant's sublime and Kantian transcendentalism. For Kant, the sublime is simply, and it is really nothing else than this, the sublime is the name for that which cannot be depicted. In other words, if you want to depict the ideal form, you depict the sublime. The sublime is the name for that which cannot be depicted. Once you understand that, everything else in Kant makes sense. For example, morality is like the sublime. Why? We don't know how God wants us to act. And so in trying to figure out what God would want us to do, we act morally. In other words, morality, like the sublime, is a stand-in for the very impossibility of doing the ideal. For the sublime, it's the aesthetic depiction of the ideal. For morality, it is the physical embodiment of the good. In both cases, we have a word, morality in the sublime, which is a distinctive sign of its own failure. I've said this before, but the same is true for Adorno when it comes to society. Adorno says that society is, in a sense, sublime. Society is simply a word for something we don't know how to define. As soon as you know exactly what a society is, as soon as you don't have a fundamental misrecognition, or what Laclau would call antagonism within society, it's no longer a society. It's just like a totalitarian echo chamber.
Yeah, that's the loop back to the authoritarian totalitarian distinction. Yeah.
I'm always glad when you find these little nuggets. Yeah, no, this is on purpose. Exactly. And so the totalitarian element is, again, the idea of within we, the people, there's a closed system and you're outside the system. Now, the Hegelian insight, which would also be the insight for the totalitarian system, is that you can't actually suggest this closeness without the exception to the closeness. In other words, the constitutive truth of the idea of the people is, of course, the other. The other is the one that retroactively generates the idea of the people. That's the secret underlying every reactionary system, that there is no such thing as the people until you've generated the supposed opposite of the people, the enemy of the people, the other, the journalist, the immigrant, the foreigner, etc. Now, this is essentially what happens within speculative idealism as well. Speculative idealism says there is no concreteness to the in itself. The in itself is not behind the barrier. Oh, we lost the connection again. I probably just forgot. The in itself is not behind the barrier, nor is the in itself in the subject who cannot reach the barrier. Instead, the in itself, we're losing connection. Instead, the in itself exists only in the barrier. In other words, essence only appears in appearance itself. It posits its own presuppositions. And that's what Zizek has from Lacan, which he applies to Hegel, is that appearance only emerges as appearance itself. And that is essence, the seemingly tautological thing. And of course, we'll talk about this in further classes. The Marxist evolution of that is always to say that the truth of any given situation, the true content of any given form, is precisely the part of no part, the thing that seems to be the non-constitutive element. The truth, we've lost the connection. The truth of the people is the other. The truth of the essence is the barrier. And so we've taken the thing that seems to be, the barrier, and we've basically said that that is what contains the essence. In other words, the thing that was supposed to be the point of breakdown of the essence contains the essence. And that is the key radical insight of speculative idealism. And the funny thing is, it wouldn't have been possible without Kant. That's what's so important to note. It's not about Hegel versus Kant. It's about Hegel looking at Kant and saying, my dear friend, you took us so far and you weren't willing to make the final conclusion. You weren't able to draw the properly traumatic conclusion from your own turn, which is that the in itself isn't behind the barrier. The in itself isn't behind the barrier. For those people on YouTube, we're losing the connection. The in itself isn't behind the barrier of subjective reason. The in itself is only in the barrier.
It really helps
in the
to slow
barrier
down,
of
though.
subjective reason. And that is how we go from traditional metaphysics to Kantian transcendentalism to speculative idealism in about 50 minutes.
Well, and I think that part of the reason that for me the visit is such a helpful story to work through that tension is because it illustrates. I mean, on the one hand, you can say the people's reaction, well, you know, there's something wrong with these townspeople that they would do such a thing. You know, they're two-faced, you know, it's because they're poor, it's because they're greedy, it's because they're resentful, it's because they're jealous, it's because of some flaw in them. And what the play recognizes is that it requires the opposite in order to manifest, to realize the violence of what they've already accepted. It's not enough for them to do, you know, it wouldn't, I feel like Kant's reaction would be to say, well, these people are an aberration, they're doing something wrong. Whereas Hegel would look at it and say, it's necessary that they denounce it in order to affirm it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And this transposes perfectly to Marxism. In a sense, like every death has to happen twice. Every revolution happens twice. It's the idea of the symbolic death within Lacan. You die once and then you die a second time. First you die physically, then you die symbolically. Of course, there's also a way in which the symbolic death of the town happens in the very act of the town thinking that it's going to become the rich town. And then it has to formalize the act retroactively through the killing of the man. Mm-hmm. So it's a very sad story in that way. This repetition, this double movement of... Lost connection again. This double movement of speculative idealism is something we're going to talk about more next week. So we're going to wrap it up here. Thank you guys so much for joining us. If you've enjoyed this class, please do consider joining our Patreon, becoming a patron today. It's just a small contribution, but it makes a really big difference in keeping these classes free and on the road, and it means we can do more touring. We're going to take this show on the road to the East Coast in March. We're gonna be in New York. We're going to be in Boston. We're going to be in Detroit. Then we're also going to be coming to Europe for European viewers. We're going to be in Germany. We're going to be in France. We're going to be in the UK. We're going to do a whole spring and summer of taking these classes on the road and hopefully meeting some of you guys along the way. Mm-hmm. So thank you guys so much for joining us today. It has been our absolute pleasure to bring you the principles of Kantian transcendentalism, of Hegelian speculative idealism, of traditional metaphysics. I love that we've been able to bring high theory to a low platform such as this. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been our absolute pleasure. And for those of you who would like to join us in the seminar, the tutorial, the bonus discussion, we're going to be going live on Discord in 5 minutes to take your questions about Hegel, about Kant, about German idealism. So if you'd like to join us, please take a moment to sign up to our Discord, which you can find in the link in our bio. Until then, keep thinking like you mean it, and we'll see you next week. All right. Bye, guys.
Have a great week, everyone.